In Kenya, the day often begins with something simple, a warm cup of tea shared at the family table, always with milk, always with a quiet moment before the world awakens. It is a scene so ordinary, so steady that it could belong to any of us. Yet behind that peaceful morning ritual, a very different rhythm is echoing across the African continent, one that the rest of the world has barely noticed. Africa is not announcing its digital future with noise. There are no dramatic billboards, no self-congratulating speeches, no global campaigns demanding attention. Instead, something far more impressive is happening: a quiet construction project built piece by piece, far from the spotlight. And if you were not paying close attention to what unfolded in the city of Conakry this year, you may have missed the moment Africa gently but decisively changed direction. For 3 days, presidents, ministers, engineers, and innovators gathered under one roof. But they did not come to repeat the usual conference speeches, the kind filled with slogans and distant promises. This time, the tone was different. People spoke with deadlines, not dreams. They described work already underway, not aspirations floating in the distant future. You could feel it in the calm seriousness of the room. Africa wasn't imagining a new digital era. It was building one. And that leads us to a simple but powerful question. Is the world, especially the United States, truly ready for a digitally unified Africa, a continent where identity, payments, data, and innovation flow across borders as easily as a morning cup of tea? Because the transformation now unfolding isn't loud, it isn't flashy, but it is real, and it is accelerating. If you're watching this, you are among the few who will understand this shift before the headlines catch up. Please like and share this video if you want more people to understand what Africa is truly becoming. And subscribe if you believe that truth, not noise, is what shapes the future. When the Transform Africa Summit opened in Conakry, the atmosphere did not resemble the typical international conference most of us have grown used to watching on television. There were no grand theatrics, no oversized stages, no leaders trying to outshine one another. Instead, the gathering felt more like a disciplined engineering workshop than a political spectacle. Delegates spoke quietly but firmly, as if they were meeting inside the control room of a project already under construction. It was the 7th Transform Africa Summit, yet the tone was unlike any of the previous ones. For years, Africa had talked about digital transformation strategies, visions, frameworks, declarations, and countless PowerPoint presentations. But this time something had shifted. The language of the summit was no longer conceptual, it was operational. Ministers discussed timelines, not theories. Engineers talked about prototypes, not possibilities. Project leaders presented progress reports rather than dreams. The difference was unmistakable. Africa was no longer planning to build a continental digital future someday. It was already laying the bricks. At the center of this transformation stood Smart Africa, an alliance that once behaved like a think tank floating ideas across borders. Now it operated like an institution managing multiple construction sites across the continent. What had once been declarations had turned into deliverables. The central message of the summit, repeated in different languages and different rooms, but always with the same conviction, was clear. By 2030, Africa intends to function as a single digital market. Not hopes to, not aims to, not will explore the possibility, but intends, a word chosen carefully, a word that signaled a new phase of confidence. This intent revealed itself not through grand slogans, but through the way officials described the work underway. A unified digital identity system, for instance, was not framed as a distant dream. It was presented as a foundation already being installed country by country, dataset by dataset. The cross-border payment pilot connecting Rwanda, Ghana, and Benin was not introduced as an experiment. It was described as phase 1 of a system meant to be scaled across the continent, transforming how Africans buy, sell, transfer, and do business with one another. Data exchange interoperability. The backbone of any modern digital society was not a topic for academic debate. It was a construction plan, with milestones, deadlines, and teams already in motion. Even AI governance, once considered too advanced or abstract for many countries, was being discussed with a unified vocabulary. Leaders from West, East, Central, Southern, and North Africa were no longer speaking from isolated digital realities. They were aligning around the same frameworks, the same standards, the same strategic objectives. What made Conakry especially symbolic was its identity as the first Francophone West African city to host the summit. It sent a message digital transformation was no longer a project of a handful of already advanced nations. It was becoming continental. The rooms were filled with leaders from all regions, countries with different histories, different political systems, different levels of infrastructure, yet everyone spoke as if they were building the same machine together. One of the most striking impressions from the summit was the sense of maturity. Africa was no longer trying to convince itself or the world that digital integration mattered. That phase was over. Nobody wasted time explaining why a digital ID system was essential or why interoperable payments were necessary. Those debates belonged to the past. The only questions that remained were technical. How fast can we build this? What obstacles remain? What partnerships accelerate the process? And most importantly, how do we make this work for 1 billion people, not just one country? It became clear over the course of those 3 days that Africa was preparing to operate not as 54 separate digital markets, but as a single digital organism, a connected, synchronized, interoperable structure capable of moving in one direction. For the first time, perhaps, in its modern history, the continent was treating digital transformation not as a luxury, not as an accessory to development, but as essential infrastructure as necessary as electricity, water, or roads. The bricks of this future were already being laid. Conakry simply made the world notice. As the summit continued, there came a moment subtle at first, almost easy to overlook when the entire atmosphere shifted. It happened not during a dramatic keynote, but during a series of quiet technical sessions where ministers and engineers sat side by side reviewing integration steps line by line. There was no applause, no theatrical lighting, no camera cues. Yet this was the true turning point. For years, African digital efforts had moved in separate directions. Rwanda championed digital identity. Kenya refined fintech. Ghana built interoperability. Nigeria seeded a startup ecosystem. South Africa strengthened cybersecurity. Each stream was powerful, but they flowed like individual rivers, parallel but disconnected. But in Conakry, you could feel those rivers beginning to converge slowly, steadily into a single current. The change was not emotional. It was architectural. And architecture, unlike speech, leaves no room for wishful thinking. Either systems connect or they do not. Either data flows or it doesn't. The seriousness in the room came from an understanding shared by everyone present. Africa had entered the execution phase and there was no turning back. One of the strongest signals of this shift was the way partnerships were framed. In the past, collaborations were often wrapped in glossy language innovation opportunities, future potential regional cooperation. But in Conakry, partners spoke like colleagues on a construction project. Every initiative had a functional purpose. Take Youth Connect, for instance. It was not introduced as a feel-good youth program. It was described as a continent-wide pipeline to equip millions of young Africans with digital skills because the digital economy they would inherit was arriving faster than predicted. The partnership with Visa was also stripped of promotional glamour. It was presented as a foundational layer for Africa's emerging cross-border payment framework, the digital rails that would allow a merchant in Nairobi to receive a payment from Abidjan as easily as one from across the street. And then there was the tri-country digital identity system, linking Rwanda, Ghana, and Benin, no longer a pilot for show, but the first building block of a continental identity architecture built to be expanded, strengthened, and eventually unified. These were not announcements. They were components. This was confidence born not from speeches, but from alignment, the kind of quiet, stubborn alignment that doesn't make headlines but changes everything. As African leaders gathered in side rooms and roundtables, discussions about digital sovereignty took center stage. A few years earlier, this concept had sounded ambitious, even idealistic, a distant goal overshadowed by the continent's dependency on external digital systems. But in Conakry, sovereignty was not philosophical, it was practical. Officials spoke openly about vulnerabilities, identity systems hosted abroad, government data stored in foreign clouds, national payment channels routed through external networks, cybersecurity frameworks influenced by outside actors. These were no longer acceptable risks. Africa's digital future could not be built on borrowed tools, rented data centers, or outsourced autonomy. The realization brought a sense of urgency that electrified the room. Even the body language of leaders reflected this shift. There was no hesitancy, no defensiveness, no hint of inferiority, only clarity. Africa was not trying to imitate Europe, Asia, or North America. It was designing a path shaped by African realities, African populations, and African economic rhythms. And with that clarity came a different kind of confidence, not loud, not prideful, but quiet and inevitable. The kind of confidence that does not need to shout, because the work speaks for itself. For the first time, Africa was no longer asking whether digital unity was possible. It was planning how to deliver it. But the question that followed, whispered in hallways, hinted at in side conversations, was even more compelling. How would the outside world react once Africa began solving its internal digital problems? The answer was already emerging, and Conakry was only the beginning. Long before any government report or economic forecast confirms it, change is most clearly felt in the routines of everyday people. And if Africa truly becomes a single digital market, the first to sense the transformation will not be presidents or ministers, it will be ordinary citizens trying to move, work, trade, or simply access the services they deserve. For decades, one of Africa's greatest burdens has been friction. Small, exhausting obstacles that appear everywhere. A business working flawlessly in one country becomes stuck just across the border. A payment system that functions at home becomes unusable a few miles away. A government service requires long lines, long explanations, or long waits. A young entrepreneur spends more time navigating bureaucracy than building anything of value. A unified digital market aims to remove those frictions quietly, persistently, and for the first time systematically. Imagine a mother traveling from Ghana to Rwanda to visit her daughter. Today she must re-identify herself at multiple offices and fill out forms that look strangely familiar but somehow incompatible. Under a unified digital identity system, she is recognized instantly. No new paperwork. No repeating herself. Her identity travels with her. Or consider a young man trying to send money to his grandmother in another country. Today, it may take days, multiple fees, and complicated instructions. With harmonized payments, the transfer becomes a simple action, a phone number, a confirmation, and it's done. No friction, no stress. These may sound like conveniences, but for millions of Africans, they represent dignity. They represent time saved, stress avoided, and trust built in the systems meant to serve them. Small and medium-sized businesses, the backbone of African economies, would experience an even more dramatic shift. A fashion designer in Accra should not have to rebuild her online store just to sell to customers in Nairobi. A farmer in Lusaka should not be forced to navigate a maze of regulations simply to access markets a short flight away. Once digital borders soften, a local business becomes a regional business almost overnight. A regional business becomes a continental one. This kind of transformation does not just boost profits, it changes psychology. Entrepreneurs begin to think bigger. They plan further into the future. They design products for 1 billion people, not just the village or city they grew up in. The sense of possibility expands. Government behavior will shift as well. Today, African nations often operate like 54 experiments running in parallel, each reinventing the wheel of AI regulation, cybersecurity, digital taxation, and public service systems. A unified digital market changes that. If Rwanda builds a digital public service platform that works, Guinea can adapt it. If Kenya develops an effective AI governance framework, Malawi can adopt it. If South Africa pioneers a cybersecurity protocol, Botswana can reinforce it. The political impact is profound. Less duplication, more shared learning, stronger regional coordination, and far greater bargaining power on the global stage. Governments also begin to gain legitimacy when services become predictable, efficient, and accessible. Citizens who once distrusted institutions start to feel that the state is responding to their needs. In many African countries, this shift alone has the power to reshape the social contract. But perhaps the greatest transformation happens in the mind. When systems function smoothly, people move differently, they plan differently, they dream differently. For the first time in generations, Africans begin to feel that the continent is opening, not closing, that opportunity does not end at a border drawn decades ago. This psychological shift, quiet but powerful, is what truly transforms nations, and it is already beginning. When a continent begins fixing its internal digital problems, the rest of the world always reacts, sometimes openly, sometimes quietly, sometimes with a discomfort that reveals more than words ever could. And that is precisely what is happening now, as Africa begins to link its identity systems, merge its payment networks, protect its data, and coordinate digital policy across borders. For decades, the global digital landscape has treated Africa as a consumer market, a place where foreign-built systems could be deployed and monetized with little resistance. identity platforms hosted on foreign servers, government data stored in clouds controlled elsewhere, payment networks routing transactions through Europe or America before reaching African banks, software for schools, hospitals, and ministries built by outside vendors following outside rules. Many of these tools were helpful, but they came with invisible strings, pricing set abroad, rules written abroad, vulnerabilities managed abroad, and data, the most valuable resource of the digital age, stored outside African jurisdiction. For as long as African countries remained digitally fragmented, these dependencies stayed hidden. But the moment nations began aligning their systems, the world noticed. You can see the shift in the tone of global corporations. Companies that once approached Africa with the confidence of established suppliers now speak with the caution of partners who suddenly realize they may need to negotiate with an entire continent, not just one ministry at a time. Words like collaboration, co-creation, and joint development appear more often now, not out of generosity but necessity. Power dynamics are changing. From an American perspective, the transformation is a mixture of promise and unease. On one hand, a digitally unified Africa represents a massive, stable market, predictable rules, harmonized standards, and a tech ecosystem ready for large-scale investment. U.S. companies excel in such environments. Africa's young population, growing talent pool, and expanding tech hubs could become fertile ground for American innovation. But there is another side to this story, a quieter, more strategic concern. A continent that controls its own data identity systems, cybersecurity frameworks, and payment rails is far harder to influence. For decades, the U.S. engaged African digital markets bilaterally, country by country. That model gave Washington flexibility and leverage. A unified digital market compresses that space. Negotiations must now take place with a bloc, not an individual nation. This reduces America's ability to shape standards, promote certain technologies, or guide policy from behind the scenes. It also introduces a significant geopolitical question: will Africa's digital future be built with American partners, or with nations that offer infrastructure without political conditions? European nations see both opportunity and competition. China sees strategic risk. And emerging digital powers? India, Brazil. Indonesia sees something else entirely, a partner rising to their level. China, in particular, is paying close attention. For years, it positioned itself as Africa's digital infrastructure builder. But a unified Africa can negotiate harder demand, more transparency, and avoid one-sided dependencies. The old model no longer applies. Europe, meanwhile, recognizes that Africa's digital awakening could redefine its economic neighborhood. A strong, connected Africa could shift trade routes, lower Europe's digital leverage, and create a southern powerhouse that cannot be ignored. But the most profound shift is conceptual. Africa is no longer being discussed as a technological follower. It is being discussed as a digital participant, even a digital force. That change alone reshapes how the world must engage with the continent. It demands respect, partnership, and long-term strategy. And for the first time in generations, Africa holds the leverage to ask, on whose terms? As the lights dimmed at the end of the Transform Africa Summit, one truth became impossible to ignore. The continent's digital awakening is no longer a prediction. It is no longer the dream of a few forward-thinking states. It is becoming a continental posture, steady, deliberate, and irreversible. And while the world may not fully understand it yet, Africa's direction is clear. In the coming decade, the continent will not be knocking on the doors of global systems asking for permission. It will be designing systems of its own. But such a shift carries consequences far beyond technology. It affects trade routes, investment strategies, cybersecurity alliances, and even the balance of global influence. For decades, Africa was seen as a space. Others shaped a market, others supplied. Now the continent is positioning itself as a digital actor capable of shaping norms, setting standards, and demanding fair partnership. This is where the quiet nature of Africa's progress becomes its greatest strength. Revolutions wrapped in noise draw resistance. Revolutions wrapped in order, competence, and alignment are harder to stop. What happened in Conakry may not generate breaking news headlines, yet it will echo through the corridors of power in Washington, Brussels, Beijing, and beyond. Still beneath all of this lies an even more important question, one that touches not systems or strategies, but people. What happens when 1 billion Africans begin to see their continent as one digital space? What happens to ambition, opportunity, mobility, and confidence when borders soften digitally, when payment barriers fall, when identity becomes universal rather than fragmented? That psychological shift from limitation to possibility may prove more transformative than any infrastructure project. It is the quiet rewiring of expectations that changes nations from the inside out. And that is why this moment matters, not only for Africa, but for the world. A digitally unified Africa could emerge as a stabilizing force, a massive innovation hub, and a partner capable of negotiating on its own terms. But it could also expose old geopolitical tensions, challenge entrenched interests, and reshape what global competition looks like in the 21st century. For viewers in the United States, especially those who have watched global power shifts unfold over decades, this raises a serious, even uncomfortable question. Will America adapt to Africa's new digital reality, or will it be caught off guard by a quiet revolution it underestimated? Because the shift is not coming. It is already here. And those who see it early will understand the world that is forming, not the one that is fading. So let me ask you, do you believe Africa is finally ready to act as one digital market? Which country do you think will benefit most from this transformation? And do you think leaders like President Ibrahim Traoré, who openly speak about sovereignty and digital independence, will play a defining role in shaping this new era? Share your thoughts in the comments. Your voice is part of this conversation. And if you feel you're among the first to truly understand Africa's digital awakening, please share this video so others can see what is unfolding behind the headlines. Subscribe if you believe that truth is more powerful than noise.